Math is a wonderful thing. Math is a really cool thing.
Alright, let us explore how to find domain of a given graph. So a student says something's wrong with the shading on this graph. What do you think it is? One possible observation will be the shaded part of the graph extends too far to the right. It should stop at x equals 4. Now let's drag the orange point to fix the shading for this graph. We use this type of shading to represent the domain of a function. All we need to do to find the domain is to cover the graph from the left endpoint all the way to the right endpoint. Now before we cover our graph, note that my left endpoint is a closed circle and my right endpoint is an open circle. So let's cover our graph by moving our slider. So the domain of this function is the portion of the x-axis that is shaded. It means that from here all the way here. Now we know that this one is a closed circle. The right endpoint is an open circle, so this should be an open circle also. Next, we identify the x value at this particular endpoint. It's equal to 1. The endpoint here is 4. Now we are ready to write our domain. So x, this one is a closed circle, so greater than or equal to 1. This is an open circle, so we are going to use less than 4. And this will be our domain for this given graph. If you would like to write your answer as a set notation, so we have to use the curly braces x such that x is greater than or equal to 1, x is less than 4, and then a curly brace. Alright, let's have our second example. First, let's identify the endpoints of this graph. The left endpoint is a closed circle and the right endpoint is an open circle. Now let's move our slider so that we can shade our graph from the left endpoint all the way to the right endpoint. The domain of this function is the portion of the x-axis that is shaded from here all the way here. Now remember, this one is a closed circle, so we should have a closed circle here. Now my right endpoint is an open circle, so this should be an open circle. Now let's identify the x value on our left endpoint. This is actually -2. This is 1. To write our domain, we will have x greater than or equal to -2. We have the line under because this one is a closed circle, less than 1 without the line under because this one is an open circle. Alright, for this next example, again, let's identify our left endpoint. This is a closed circle. The right endpoint is an open circle. Let's move our slider so that we can cover our graph from the left endpoint all the way to the right endpoint. Next, let's identify the x value on our left endpoint. My x here is -5. My x here is 10. So to write our domain, x should be greater than or equal to -5, less than 10. Now again, I have here less than without the line under because we have here an open circle. And then here I have a line under because my left endpoint is a closed circle. Alright, next example. Again, identify the left endpoint, it's a closed circle. Identify the right endpoint, it's also a closed circle. Let's shade our graph from the left endpoint all the way to the right endpoint. The portion of the x-axis that is shaded is our domain. Alright, so at this particular endpoint, my x is -6. For this endpoint, my x is 8. So to write our domain, x should be greater than or equal to -6. X is less than or equal to 8. Alright, next we are going to explore how to find the range of a given graph. Note that range is the possible y values of a given function. So to find the range, we are going to apply the same procedure that we did earlier when we find the domain. But this time, instead of checking the left endpoint and the right endpoint, we are going to check the minimum point and the maximum point. So given this graph, this is our minimum point, and this one is a closed circle, and then our maximum point, which is located here, is actually an open circle. Next, let's shade our graph all the way from the minimum point all the way to the maximum point. Now the range is the part of the y-axis, portion of the y-axis that is shaded. So from here all the way here. Now let's identify the y value on this point. It's -3, and the y value here is +3. So your range is from -3 all the way to +3. So to write our inequality, y is greater than or equal to -3. I have a line under because this one is a closed circle. It is closed because the minimum point is a closed circle. Y is less than 3 without the line under because this one is an open circle based from the fact that the maximum point is an open circle. And again, to write this using our set notation, it will be y such that y is greater than or equal to -3, at the same time less than 3. And don't forget your curly braces. Alright, for this next example, again, identify the minimum point, which is this, and it is a closed circle. The maximum point of this graph is this one, and this is an open circle. Let's move our slider to shade our graph, starting from the minimum point all the way to the maximum point. So the portion of the y-axis that is shaded is our range. So from here all the way here. Now this one is a closed circle because my minimum point is closed circle, and this one is an open circle because my maximum point is an open circle. Alright, so this one is a -3, this one is +3. So to write our range, y greater than or equal to -3. I have a line under because this one is closed. Y less than 3 without the line under because this one is an open circle. Alright, before we move on to the next example, I would like to emphasize that any point on the graph will be considered as a closed circle or closed dot, unless they're going to write open circle here. Then it means that this part of the graph is an open dot. All of the point, or every point on this curve, every point on this graph will be considered as a closed circle. Okay, so from here all the way up here will be considered as a closed circle except this one. We are going to use that concept for our next example. Alright, so again, let's identify the minimum point. Now be careful on this example because the minimum point is not this. We have a point that is lower than this. We can have this point or this point. Alright, now we said earlier that every point on this line will be considered as a closed circle. So it means that this is a closed circle. This is also a closed circle. The minimum point is this, and it is a closed circle. The maximum point could be this one, or this, or this one. Okay, we have a lot of maximum point here, and our maximum point is actually a closed circle also. So to shade our graph, starting from the minimum point, we have to start here all the way here. The portion of the y-axis from this line to this line will be our range. So from here all the way up here. Now remember, this one is a closed circle, so we should have a closed circle here, and this is also a closed circle. The maximum point is a closed circle, so we should have a closed circle here. To write our range, it will be y greater than or equal to, this is -2, this one, the y value is +2, so y is greater than or equal to -2, y is less than or equal to +2. So this should be our range. Alright, next example. Let's start by finding the minimum point. The minimum point on this graph is this, and it is a closed circle. The maximum point for this graph is actually here, which is closed circle. So be careful, this is not our maximum point. We have another point that is higher than this, which is this point. And we said that every point on the curve will be considered as a closed circle or a closed dot, unless specified that we have an open circle, just like this one. This one is an open circle. Let's move our slider to shade our graph, starting from the minimum point all the way to the maximum point. The y value on this point is actually 0. The y value on this point is 4. Now remember, this one is a closed circle, and the maximum point is a closed circle. The portion of the y-axis that is shaded is our range. From here, closed circle, all the way up here, which is also a closed circle. The range will be y greater than or equal to 0, less than or equal to 4.
Math is a wonderful thing. Math is a really cool thing.